state legislatures and to implement the specific tax, these efforts failed to provide the Southern Army with sufficient quantity of resources. These failures, along with the difficulties of Greene's environment, prevented the Southern Army from functioning solely on conventional logistics and required the supplementary use of irregular logistics operations. Greene's intention of combining conventional and irregular operations became clear as early as October 1780, when he wrote to George Washington that he would divide the Southern Army into two parts. This decision supported his campaign strategy based on maintaining movement throughout the Carolinas while threatening British garrisons, avoiding decisive battle, and fighting a kind of partisan war until the Southern Army could recruit, equip, and train enough soldiers to defeat Cornwallis's forces in open battle. When Greene arrived in Charlotte to take command, he formed his main body under Brigadier General Isaac Huger and created a flying army under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. This highly mobile unit consisted of 2 companies of Maryland regulars, a detachment of 250 experienced Virginia militia, and Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's regiment of light dragoons. Also, Greene placed Morgan in charge of 2 militia detachments under Brigadier General William Davidson and Militia Brigadier General Thomas Sumter. The Flying Army's mission was to provide protection and to spirit up the population in its area of operations, to annoy the enemy and keep down loyalists, and to collect the enemy's potential forage and form it into small magazines. Additionally, Greene provided Morgan with the freedom to fight on the offensive or defensive at his discretion, as well as near complete autonomy in completing his mission. Immediately following his appointment to command the Flying Army, Morgan began leading irregular logistics operations that would make a substantial impact in the southern colonies for the remaining years of the war. Receiving his marching orders on 16 December, Morgan led the Flying Army to a location between the Broad and Pacolet Rivers, which are approximately 140 miles away from the main body of Greene's army. Greene chose this location based on the lack of forage in the Charlotte area, as well as the large population of zealous Whigs who could possibly provide more recruits for the Southern Army. Also, Morgan's position allowed his force to threaten the flank and rear of any British advance into the Carolinas and would allow him to impede a British advance or harass the rear of an enemy retreat. As a response to his discovery of the divided Southern Army, Cornwallis decided to split his force into 3 parts: one to hold the British garrison at Camden, one that Cornwallis himself would lead north from South Carolina, and a legion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton sent specifically to destroy the Flying Army. Morgan was aware that Tarleton was in pursuit, so he worked diligently to improve his light force's mobility by putting 100 infantrymen on horseback and requesting pack saddles from Greene's quartermaster. The Flying Army would use these to carry equipment with a light pack train rather than a cumbersome wagon train. Morgan stated to Greene that it was incompatible with the nature of light troops to be encumbered by baggage. Cornwallis would later learn this lesson through trial and tribulation in the rural Carolina terrain. After increasing the mobility of his force, Morgan began to conduct irregular logistics operations vital to the sustainment of the Southern Army. Attacks on British and Loyalist raid and forage parties, interdiction of British supply lines, and independent foraging operations eventually became common practice for Morgan, as their psychological impacts often reduced support for British Army and prevented British troops from conducting foraging operations to sustain themselves. Also, the divided Southern Army posed an increased threat to British interior lines of communication. This required the British to provide large armed escorts for any attempt at resupply from the coast or communication between forces, which in turn lessened their capability to pursue Greene or defend their garrisons. Morgan's first operation with the Flying Army took place immediately following his arrival between the Broad and Pacolet Rivers. Morgan received intelligence about a party of Georgia Loyalists who had advanced into Fair Forest, South Carolina, about 40 miles from his camp, and were, in Morgan's words, insulting and plundering the good people in that neighborhood. Morgan dispatched William Washington's dragoons to counter this problem, and the force managed to engage Loyalist Colonel Thomas Waters and his raiders at a place called Hammond's Store. During this engagement, Washington's men cut down 150 Loyalists and captured another 40. This and other similar attacks were effective support from the population in the immediate area who were becoming restless under oppressive royal control and resented the loyalist parties who burned the property of their rebel neighbors. While attacks like that at Hammond's store prevented British foraging parties from plundering the countryside, the Flying Army also conducted attacks against British forces trying to destroy available forage. Morgan described these operations to Greene, stating that he intended to use forces under Colonel Andrew Pickens to, quote, cut off small parties that may be sent out for the purpose of destroying the country, as I expect that will be their aim to prevent us from getting supplies in that back country. In addition to attacks on small forage parties, the Flying Army commonly interdicted British supply and baggage trains in order to gain further provisions for the Southern Army and deny British vital resources. Because British forces were thinly dispersed with long, slow lines of communication between garrisons, the Flying Army attempted on several occasions to defeat garrisons through supply interdiction rather than through siege. In a letter written on January 8, 1781, Greene instructed Morgan on types of interdiction operations to perform. He wrote, "If you employ detachments to intercept supplies going to 96 in Augusta, it will perplex the enemy much. If you think Augusta or even Savannah can be surprised, and your force will admit of a detachment for the purpose and leave you sufficiently to keep up a good countenance, you may attempt it." In this letter, Greene also stated the importance of using small parties and maintaining surprise in the attack, and he gave advice that killing enemy draft horses and recruiting enemy cavalry horses could have a more devastating effect on the enemy than defeat in open battle. In what became the War of Posts, the back-and-forth battle for the possession of fortresses and garrisons throughout the Carolinas, supply interdiction operations to isolate the enemy and gain supply became a preferred method to wear down British forces without having to engage in open battle and risk the preservation of the Southern Army. Although widely successful, Morgan's offensive logistics operations were not adequate alone for providing sustenance. The Flying Army also conducted its own forage operations in the face of their enemy. Morgan's troops created a system of small magazines that they could move quickly in the event of a rapid British advance that could still contribute to the Southern Army sustainment and that prevented the British from gathering forage in their immediate area. The task of collecting forage was not easy in the Carolinas, as the population would not, according to Greene, gather in their crops from the field because depositing their grain in their barns exposed it to be seized by their friends and burnt by their enemies. However, despite difficulties in finding and procuring supplies throughout the South, the Flying Army was able to contribute to the small magazine system that supported both its own movements and those of the main body of the Southern Army. Upon receiving orders from Greene to establish the magazine system, Morgan dispatched his Commissary General and Forage Master, Captain C.K. Chitty, to collect and store all available forage and provisions between the Broad and Catawba rivers into a system of magazines. The magazine system allowed the main body in the Flying Army to continuously maneuver throughout the South without having to stop for forage, which in turn allowed them to maintain the initiative, fight at the times and places of their choosing, and preserve their forces against the pursuing British. Morgan's irregular logistics operations in support of the Southern campaign had many significant effects on the British fighting cause in the South. First, Greene's decision to create the Flying Army as a light, mobile, independent unit forced Cornwallis to divide his own forces in an attempt to defeat the Southern Army in detail. Cornwallis's operational decisions came as reactions to those of Greene throughout the campaign, as Greene led Cornwallis on a chase throughout the South and only chose to openly fight at opportunities favorable to the Southern Army. Morgan's constant movement, supported by his magazine system, lured Cornwallis and Tarleton into a pursuit which eventually necessitated that they destroy all their excess baggage to maintain their movement speed. Also, Morgan's missions to destroy bands of loyalists and British foraging parties contributed to an increase in popular support for the rebellion by demonstrating the legitimacy of the Continental forces in providing protection. Later in the campaign, supply interdiction